On the morning of January 15, 1947, a woman walking through an empty lot in Los Angeles looked down and saw what she thought was a discarded broken mannequin. The body was naked, pale, and unnaturally clean against the grass. Then she realized it was a woman. Her body had been cut completely in half at the waist. Her face had been brutally mutilated, the corners of her mouth cut into a grotesque, unnatural shape. She had suffered other severe injuries before death, and whoever had done this had taken the body away from the place where she was killed and brought it here. There was almost no blood in the field. That detail would disturb investigators because it meant this patch of Los Angeles was not a murder scene at all. It was where the killer had decided the body should be found. The woman was 22 years old. Her name was Elizabeth Short. Within days, newspapers would give her another name, one that would outlive almost everything known about the woman herself, the Black Dahlia. But before Los Angeles turned her death into a legend, there was a much more disturbing question. Who had done this to Elizabeth Short, and what kind of place had she been taken to before her body was left in that field? Welcome to the cursed Hollywood. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, in Boston, Massachusetts, the third of 5 daughters in a family whose life became unstable while she was still young. Her father, Cleo Short, built miniature golf courses until the Depression destroyed the business. And in 1930, he disappeared, leaving his wife Phoebe to raise the girls. Elizabeth grew up in Medford, where she was remembered as a quiet, attractive girl who dreamed of escaping the ordinary life around her. Her health complicated those plans. She suffered from asthma and severe bronchitis, and the cold Massachusetts winters were difficult for her. At 16, she left for Florida to spend time with her father, who had unexpectedly reappeared. The reunion did not last. After discovering that he had been living under another identity, Elizabeth left and eventually made her way west. California was where she wanted to be. Hollywood was filled with young women who believed they could become actresses, and Elizabeth was determined to try. She had dark hair, striking features, and a carefully maintained appearance that drew attention wherever she went. She took jobs when she could, moved between different places, and depended at times on friends and acquaintances for somewhere to stay. Her life was unsettled, but the goal remained the same. She wanted a career in Hollywood. She wanted to be seen on screen, to build a name for herself, and to escape the uncertainty that had followed her since childhood. By the middle of the 1940s, Elizabeth was living in California and moving through a world of servicemen, restaurants, hotels, apartments, and people she often knew only briefly. By January 1947, Elizabeth Short was moving through Los Angeles without a permanent home of her own. She had been staying with friends and acquaintances, carrying her belongings with her and depending on the people around her for somewhere to sleep. In early January, she traveled to San Diego with Robert Red Manley, a married salesman she had been seeing. On January 9th, he drove her back toward Los Angeles and left her at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. That was the last confirmed place where she was known to have been alive. Inside the Biltmore, Elizabeth made several phone calls. She spoke with people she knew, including someone she was supposed to meet. She was seen in the hotel lobby, and at some point she disappeared from the building. Her belongings were later found in a suitcase at a Los Angeles bus station, but Elizabeth was gone. For the next several days, the trail became increasingly uncertain. People came forward saying they had seen her. Others claimed they had spoken to her. But investigators could not establish a clear account of where she had gone after leaving the Biltmore, who she had been with, or where she had spent her final hours. Then, on January 15th, everything changed. Elizabeth's body was found in a vacant lot near Leimert Park. By then, whatever had happened to her during those missing days had already ended in something far more brutal than anyone looking for her could have imagined. Elizabeth Short's body had been cut cleanly in two at the waist. The The upper and lower halves had been separated with such precision that investigators began considering whether the killer had some knowledge of anatomy or dissection. She had not simply been beaten or stabbed and abandoned. Her body had been deliberately mutilated after death, and the injuries were extensive enough to make the scene one of the most disturbing homicide cases Los Angeles had ever seen. Her face had been badly cut. The wounds extended from the corners of her mouth, creating the grotesque expression that would later become one of the most recognizable images associated with the case. Her body was completely naked, and investigators found further cuts and injuries across her body. The violence was so deliberate that detectives could not treat the mutilation as something that had happened in the chaos of the killing. It appeared to have required time and control. Then there was the strangest detail of all. There was virtually no blood where Elizabeth had been found. A body mutilated to this extent should have left an obvious blood trail, yet the vacant lot contained almost none. To investigators, that suggested Elizabeth had already been dead and cleaned elsewhere before her body was brought to the field. The place where Los Angeles found her was therefore probably not the place where she died. Someone had needed a private location where Elizabeth could be killed. Her body could be cut apart and mutilated, and the remains could be cleaned before being transported through the city. And then, after all of that, the killer placed her beside the sidewalk in an exposed position where she would almost certainly be discovered. The brutality was horrifying. The preparation was even more disturbing, because this did not look like a murder that had ended with a body being hurriedly abandoned. The most unsettling thing about Elizabeth Short's body was not simply what had been done to it. It was where the body was found. There was almost no blood in the vacant lot. For a woman who had been violently mutilated, that made little sense if the field was where she had died. Investigators therefore had a grim conclusion to work with. Elizabeth had almost certainly been killed somewhere else and brought there afterward. The FBI later described the absence of blood as an indication that she had been killed elsewhere. That meant there was another crime scene. The field itself offered almost nothing that could tell detectives where that other place was. And the way her body had been cut created another problem. The bisection was clean enough that investigators considered the possibility that the killer had knowledge of dissection or anatomy. The FBI eventually helped check students at the University of Southern California Medical School as part of that line of investigation. But the killer had left no name, no confession, and no clear path back to the location where Elizabeth had actually died. The investigation should have ended with the discovery of Elizabeth Short's body. Instead, something happened that made the case even stranger. Someone began communicating with the authorities. An anonymous letter appeared claiming to be connected to the Black Dahlia case. Investigators could not simply dismiss it. If the writer really was Elizabeth's killer, this could be the first direct contact they had ever received from the person responsible. The FBI examined fingerprints associated with the letter and searched its records for a match. There was one problem. The fingerprints did not match anyone in the Bureau's files. The possible breakthrough led nowhere. That left detectives with a disturbing possibility. The person responsible for Elizabeth's murder might have been close enough to the investigation to send information to authorities, yet careful enough to leave them without a usable identity. And the case was becoming public by the hour. Elizabeth had already been identified through her fingerprints, just 56 minutes after the FBI received blurred copies of them from Los Angeles. The Bureau already had those fingerprints because Elizabeth had applied for a job at the Camp Cook military installation in 1943 and had later been arrested in Santa Barbara for underage drinking. The FBI even had her mugshot. Now her name was everywhere. The newspapers had a murdered young woman, a horrifying body, and a mystery with no killer. They gave the victim a nickname, and Elizabeth Short disappeared behind it. But investigators still had one thing they desperately needed: person. The press gave her the name that would follow her forever: the Black Dahlia. The FBI records that the nickname was linked to her rumored preference for wearing black clothing and to the Blue Dahlia, a film that had recently been released. Her photograph was circulated. Details about her appearance and personal life were printed for strangers to read. That attention created a strange problem for the detectives. The more the newspapers published, the more people came forward. Some genuinely believed they had information. Others wanted attention. And as the story grew, Elizabeth's real life began disappearing beneath the image the press had created. She had come to California hoping to become known as an actress. Instead, the country learned her name because someone had murdered her in a way that shocked even seasoned investigators. And now the newspapers had given that murder a name that was easier to remember than Elizabeth Short. The Black Dahlia. The legend had begun before her killer had ever been found. The newspapers had turned Elizabeth Short's murder into one of the biggest crime stories in Los Angeles. And that publicity created a new problem for the detectives. People began claiming they had killed her. The strangest part was that investigators had deliberately kept some of the most disturbing details of Elizabeth's mutilation away from the public. Those details could be used as a test. And that is exactly what made the false confessions so frustrating. People were willing to put themselves into the center of the Black Dahlia investigation, but claiming responsibility was not the same thing as knowing what had happened. The investigation, therefore, became a strange parade of possible killers. Every new confession had to be checked. Every new name had to be investigated. And every time another suspect failed to produce something only the killer could have known, detectives were back where they started. The investigation kept circling the same question. Who could have done something like this to Elizabeth Short? One of the earliest theories focused on the precision of the cuts. Investigators wondered whether the person responsible had medical or anatomical knowledge. The body had been divided so cleanly that the possibility could not simply be ignored. Then there were the people who had crossed paths with Elizabeth. Men she had dated, men she had met, people who claimed to have seen her shortly before she disappeared. The problem was that the case had very little solid evidence connecting any one of them to the murder. A suspect could look suspicious in a newspaper and still have nothing that would stand up as proof. Over the decades, the list grew into a catalog of possibilities. Doctors, criminals, acquaintances, strangers, and men who simply happened to fit some part of the theory surrounding the crime. But one name eventually became more famous than almost all the others. Dr. George Hodel was a Los Angeles physician who became a suspect in the Black Dahlia investigation in 1950. Several years after Elizabeth's murder, he was not convicted, and the case against him has remained disputed. Years later, his son Steve Hodel, a former Los Angeles police detective, became convinced that his father was Elizabeth Short's killer and spent decades building a case against him. The theory is disturbing partly because it attempts to explain several details at once. Hodel was a doctor, which supporters of the theory argue could explain the apparent precision of Elizabeth's mutilation. His home, the Soden House in Los Angeles, has also been proposed by supporters as a possible location connected to the crime. His son has pointed to photographs, handwriting comparisons, alleged statements, and other material as pieces of a larger case. But none of that turned George Hodel into a legally established killer. He was never charged with Elizabeth Short's murder. That distinction matters because the Black Dahlia case has accumulated so many theories that suspicion can easily start sounding like fact. Hodel remains one of the most discussed suspects, but the official mystery has never been resolved. The FBI's historical account still describes Elizabeth Short's murder as unsolved and says the murderer has never been found. And that leaves the most uncomfortable possibility of all.